Gilson provides an evaluation of a few other neo-scholastic authors as well. One author is Father Picard, whom Gilson spends considerable time evaluating in his Thomist Realism and the Critique of Knowledge, although he does not seem to take Father Picard's argument to be on the same level as those of Cardinal Mercier or Monsignor Noel. With each critical realist that Gilson evaluates, the details differ, but it is the same conclusion that is drawn. One either starts as an idealist or as a realist. If a person thinks he can make this choice after a critical evaluation of the theory of knowledge, he has actually made the choice to be an idealist in the very act of this decision. This is a choice that is made in the beginning. We now turn to why one would and should make such a choice. In Etienne Gilson's A Handbook for Beginning Realists, Gilson offers 30 points of reflection, each in the form of a single paragraph. We shall take a look here at the first in some depth, using points from his other reflections to deepen our understanding. Quote, "The first step on the realist path is to recognize that one has always been a realist. The second is to recognize that however hard one tries to think differently, one will never manage to. The third is to realize that those who claim they think differently think as realists as soon as they forget to act apart. If one then asks oneself why, one's conversion to realism is all but complete." The first step on the realist path is to recognize that one has always been a realist. Realism is, of course, the default position, the common sense position. Now, one may reply that the philosopher is one who overcomes common sense, but this is not accurate. Rather, the philosopher is one who develops and forms what he knows, perfecting the use of common sense. The fact that realism is the common sense position is not an argument for one to accept a naive common sense, but rather to demonstrate the right use of the senses and the intellect in knowledge of the real world as they are. Commonly, arguments are made against realism on the basis of a mistrust of the senses. One such argument is that when dreaming, we do think we are knowing a real world around us, and yet this is not the case. From here, it is supposedly proved that our thinking we are reaching the real world out there with our thought is not reliable. Quote, "A man who is dreaming feels no different from a man who is awake, but anyone who is awake knows he is altogether different from someone who is dreaming." Unquote. Another similar argument is that of illusions, but we see again that it is on the side of idealism, not realism, that the trouble is unanswerable. The fact that there are visual and other illusions proves all our perceptions are not illusions. Quote, "The idealist only finds these illusions so upsetting because he does not know how to prove they are illusions. The realist has no reason to be upset by them, since for him they really are illusions." Unquote. The second point is to recognize that however hard one tries to think differently, one will never manage to, as Gilson says. When Descartes wrote his Meditations, it certainly gave man something to think about, even if he was in no way the first to ponder such questions. But even Descartes showed, as we have mentioned above, that he was in intention a realist. Even he seemed to realize that his awareness of himself as thinking thing was preceded by his knowledge of himself as thinking thing. For the, quote, "greatest difference between the realist and the idealist is that the idealist thinks, whereas the realist knows. The idealist, however, because he goes from thought to things, cannot know whether what he starts from corresponds with an object or not. Do we not ask, if told by someone that, quote, they are thinking, ask the automatic question, thinking about what?" The third point is to realize that those who claim they think differently think as realists as soon as they forget to act the part. Many of these idealist intellectuals have developed extensive and logically coherent systems in the manner of their dialogue and of their literary output. But when it comes to the actual living of ordinary life, simple conversations with them will almost always reveal a realist assumption, even if subconscious. This is something that many would not even deny. René Descartes and David Hume would each tell you that you should live not as a skeptic, but through your common sense reasoning. Descartes' skepticism obviously derived from his subjectivism and idealism. Hume, a professed empiricist, showed many tendencies, however, of the rationalist in his skeptical thought. Both thinkers, however, acted upon their realist assumptions in their day-to-day activities, whenever they were not actively contemplating their new worlds. Point 4. If one asks oneself why, one's conversion to realism is all but complete. Rather than being enlightened by a new vision of the truth, as an idealist might claim about their idealism, The idealist in reality has to keep convincing himself of the truth of his system. He must continually adjust the reality around him to fit into the mold of his preconceived system. The realist, however, simply updates his total experience of reality and modifies his thoughts according to that reality. Rather than spending his efforts in modifying reality, he grows in understanding of it. When one tires of the fight to create his world and ponders simply living it, he is all but a realist. In discussing the possibility of escape from subjectivism, our author Gallagher stated that, quote, once we recognize that there is no problem of getting outside of consciousness, we have recovered an essential vantage point. To be conscious is already to be outside oneself. We do not have to break through the container of consciousness, because consciousness is not a container, unquote. One ought not to begin inside thought and try to find a way out, for that very starting point is an error. One need not escape from subjectivism from within it, but need only avoid its false foundation. This is similar to the position of Gilson. If one is to be a realist, one must begin with realism. He must begin with the self-evident real being of external things. Not that his realism is naive common-sense realism, for it is reflective and conscious of its own foundation. But there is no need to enter into the Cartesian endeavor of demonstrating their being, for their being is the starting point of our thought. It is the first thing we know, without which there is no consciousness. If we try walking down the Cartesian road, we will never reach our desired destination. If one is to be a realist, he must recognize that there is no bridge that needs to be crossed from thought to thing, and that if one employs the idealist critical method, he will never be able to build such a bridge. In Gilson's words, there is no middle ground. You must either begin as a realist with being, in which case you will have knowledge of being, or begin as a critical idealist with knowledge, in which case you will never come into contact with being, unquote. Being is the only sound starting point for philosophy. While the last few centuries have seen the method of idealism tried and modified in so many ways in a critical attempt to secure our knowledge, the rapidly changing systems ought to tell us something of the instability of this project. True, most of our contemporaries think that, at bottom, being a philosopher and adopting an idealist method are one and the same thing, says Gilson. But as philosophy is the love of wisdom, we must ask if our philosophy is bringing us an understanding of reality. Is that not its purpose? The realist needs to be careful to always let the world around him shape his understanding of that world, modifying his own understanding as he grows. But at least the realist system places this demand on the philosopher. While the study of philosophy itself is certainly important, in the end we ought to be studying things, so as to have greater knowledge. Quote, when an idealist genuinely thinks as an idealist, he perfectly embodies the essence of the professor of philosophy, whereas the realist, when he genuinely thinks as a realist, conforms himself to the authentic essence of a philosopher. For a philosopher talks about things, while a professor of philosophy talks about philosophy, unquote. These are certainly powerful words, spoken by a professor of philosophy, one of the greatest historians of philosophy of the last century, and, while a true realist, a man of great wisdom.